entrance to the Moruya Cemetery, which is sort of my local cemetery, and it has these rather unassuming concrete pillars, which is interesting because Moruya is famous for its granite. The first grave actually in here, this top part is I think the Presbyterian section, and then down there along the road is the Catholic, and over yonder is the Anglican. But this first grave is Juliet McIntosh and her husband John Glasgow McIntosh. And I've actually done a bit of research on these guys recently, but I'm not talking about them at the moment. The grave I'm more interested in at the moment is that obelisk down there, so I'm going to pause and head down yonder. So this fairly imposing monument, it's probably by a fair margin the largest in the Moruya Cemetery, belongs to the Byrne family of Kadji. Charles Byrne had the Kadji property for many years. It's now a little sort of a locality out the back of Badalla, south of Moruya, and it at one time was a big grazing property. And Charles Byrne's father was a guy called Hugh Vestey Byrne, and he arrived in Australia in, I believe, 1806, and he was transported to Australia along with a bloke called Michael Dwyer. And Michael Dwyer was the leader of a group, one of the leaders of the United Irishmen, who of course staged a rebellion in Ireland in 1798, and again had a crack at it in 1803. I think it was after that that Charles's father Hugh was arrested. He came from Wicklow in Ireland and was transported to Australia. And Charles's mother, from memory, her surname was McCarthy, and I can't think of her first name. But you know, as you can well imagine, Charles was a man of means, and as this grave and monument suggests. And somebody's actually put perspex over the marble, which is a good idea. And it's got sort of all his family and children. I think Arthur is the most recent person buried here, 1984. Yeah, very, very stately grave, and a fairly interesting character buried there. Just past the Byrnes is some graves belonging to the Heffernans, and the Heffernans were a family still around in Moruya, quite a few Heffernans, who were really instrumental in the dairy industry, which was a big industry from Moruya. Like most towns up and down the New South Wales coast and into Gippsland, dairying was quite big. This is probably one of the more famous graves and people buried here in the Moruya Cemetery. This is the grave of Miles O'Grady, who was a mounted constable, as you can see on the tombstone there. And he was killed in an altercation with the Clark gang. Actually, specifically, I believe, was possibly killed by a bloke called William Fletcher. And Miles O'Grady was on duty in Nerragunda, which is once again another town out the back of Badalla, and it was a major gold mining area at the time. Now there's probably a few hundred people live there. At this time there was a few thousand, and Miles was the constable station there. And the Clark gang were fairly notorious bushrangers, incredibly violent, prone to murder and that sort of thing. And they'd gone down to Bega for the races, and it was quite common in those days for horses to be stolen. Races were a good place to steal fast horses, essentially. And they had in their company a bloke called William Fletcher, and he was from Moruya. And his sister, Anne, had had a relationship with Francis Flanagan Jr., who was the son of Moruya's sort of earliest European settler, Francis Flanagan. And Fletcher's sister had become pregnant out of wedlock, and he intended to go and murder Francis Flanagan Jr. And So he'd hooked up with the Clark gang. They'd gone to steal horses at the Bega races. They'd had no luck stealing horses at the Bega races. I don't know why. So they'd made their way back towards Moruya on foot. And this brought them through Narragunda. And on the way into Narragunda, they crossed paths with a Chinese miner. And they shot him and killed him and took his horse. So there was one horse. And then a member of the Emmett family, who were a prominent family in the area, was riding out of town. They shot at him, injured him, took his horse and headed into Narragunda. And Miles O'Grady at the time was sick in bed. He had a flu or something, and the Clark gang rode into town and started trouble and stirring things up. And Miles O'Grady got out of bed to confront them, and there was an exchange of gunfire, and very sadly he was killed. And I think initially he may have been buried at Narragunda, and his body was later moved and interned here in Moruya. It's quite he's sort of in a space all of his own, and it's quite a poignant little grave to a young man, 25 years old. There's another grave here that's sadly been knocked over. I think that says Edward Coughlin, and that's a familiar name, but I can't place it. And a native of Roscommon Island, died October 1867. It was a fairly early grave from Moruya, quite a nice sort of a grave. It has this Celtic cross and a sort of an angel motif along the top. It's really nice. Down here, these two rather dingy graves, which I actually didn't know were here, are William Kay, who was my great-grandmother's father, and his father, Joseph Kay, who came out to Australia from Liverpool. And I think I probably need to come over here and give these a bit of a clean. I don't know why neither of their wives are buried there or got headstones. I may need to investigate that. So as I was saying, this sort of bottom half of the cemetery, you couldn't actually see the road when I was saying it, is the Catholic half. And it is nearly a half. Interestingly enough, Moruya's earliest settler, Francis Flanagan, was Irish, and in the early days of Moruya, the population was about 50% Irish, which is significant when you consider the population of New South Wales was only about 25% Irish. And it was, men like Charles Byrne and Francis Flanagan who were really instrumental in the town. Another person who was really instrumental, an Irishman, was this guy, Thomas Flood, and his son, John. And I think there was another Thomas, and they were really key in starting the Catholic Church here and the school. You can see, from the decoration of their monument, it's very, very Catholic, And this is the grave of Bridget Flanagan, who was the second wife of Francis Flanagan, who was the first settler to arrive in Moruya. It's also their daughter Bridget, who is buried here as well. Now, Francis Flanagan's, there's an older part of this cemetery, which I'm not going to go over to today. It's sort of a bit separate, called the Long Swamp Cemetery, and Francis Flanagan's buried over there. But Bridget was considerably, I think about 30 years younger than Francis when they married, and she was a convict, and he'd taken her services on to educate his children. And, they later got married. I think they had a few children out of wedlock before they got married. I think they got married in, from memory, 1839, I think, in St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. And this is their oldest surviving son. They had another son older than William, but he didn't marry. And William married Mary Agnes, who was a Lynch, who was another sort of prominent Moruya family. And I think poor old William didn't mind a drink, so to speak, and that was a contributing factor to his early death. And Mary Agnes was quite a brawny sort of a woman. She kept the family together, inherited quite a substantial property on the northern bank of the Moruya River and managed it as a single mother raising young children, which is quite impressive for that day and age, I think. So this sort of under these trees is really where a lot of the very prominent members of Irish families were buried. The Cardins here were publicans. They had a pub up in Moruya where Vinnie's is now in Southern Phone called the Royal, I think, Cardin's Royal Hotel. This monument down here belongs to a relative of mine, my great-great-grandfather's brother, Martin Keating, who was another publican and by all accounts a total and utter rogue. He had the first mail coach run from Moruya to Araluen, which was a big gold mining town in the day. And there's another, I think that's some of his kids over there, Martin, I see, and Vincent, Aloysius. Yeah, but you know, it's interesting, Moruya, as I mentioned, is very famous for its granite, but there's a lot of granite headstones, but there's also a lot of concrete. And you can kind of piece together, this very distinctive style was used sort of in the later part of the 19th century compared to the earlier part of the 20th century, and then sort of after maybe the sort of 1920s you get these smaller sort of slab headstones rather than your big flat ones. I do like to sort of tidy up and pull a few weeds out when I'm over here, but it's a bit blustering cold this afternoon. It's been very wet, so I might leave this between NS Wise and Beatrice Wise. I'm assuming we're husband and wife, so I might come and weed their little patch of ground between them another day. Here's one of those sort of slab headstones I was talking about, Henry James Thompson. And you see this a lot with the, I don't know if it was the head, you know, they've sort of got this slab of stone on this concrete headstone, and they've only sort of put two little dots of adhesive. And there's quite a few instances where that's happened around this cemetery, so I don't know if it was a dodgy sort of process or what. This is a sort of interesting grave I saw the other day. Milliken, they were still around in Moruya. They were settlers up the Dewar River out the back here. I don't recognise these names though, so, but obviously Ronald or Edith, I don't know how Freemasons operate, but I think the pentagram, and I think that's a compass. I think they're Masonic symbols. This is a grave belonging to James Flanagan, I believe, and his wife, Catherine. They were different Flanagans to the ones I spoke about earlier. But I do like to make rubbings of some of these. This one's not too bad. You can read it fairly easy, even though it's broken. But I will be making some rubbings of some of the more faded graves, headstones, in the next few weeks. I've got a few projects going on at the moment, but I do want to identify some of these broken and you know, graves you can't read the headstones on, and possibly put a sign, you know, a little plaque on them. They'll probably just get vandalised, but you know, you can't let your own good intentions be subject to the poor intentions of other people. I'm not going to walk up there today, but you can see there's a sort of paling fence, and what the Eurobodalla Shire Council have done is put a little depot for gravel and dirt and stuff up there, which, you know, I can understand to some extent, but if you're going to do that, at least make it look nice. you know, have a bit of respect for what this place is. Which, you know, I must say disappointingly that I don't think the Shire workers maintain it really nicely and come and mow and stuff, but the Yuba Shire Council is basically only interested in things that can make money and things that are of an interest to tourists. And, you know, I like to go and have a look at, you know, cemeteries and read people's headstones and, you know, find out who were living in towns, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago. But, you know, I don't think most people do. Interestingly, I've stumbled across the Walters family here, and they were the undertakers, the local undertakers, and carpenters, and obviously made coffins. I might actually come over and give their a little clean up and take some rub-ins. Rather a plain sort of a grave for an undertaker, but maybe that was, you know, it was just business, I guess. Here's a broken Augustus Boot, who was that was his son. Edward Boot was one of our early doctors. His walking stick is in the Moruya Museum. He had a property out at Yarraji near the river. It was a really beautiful cross there with, I don't know, flower. I'm not good with flowers, but they look like a sort of an orchidy thing on them. I'm just gonna finish up. There's so much more here I can and most likely will go through in the future, but for now I'm just going to give you a sort of a panorama of the cemetery back towards the gate there. I was going to try and keep this video quite short, but I do get carried away, and I have very